Jesus is one of the most influential people in human history. Billions of people have followed him. His name has shaped cultures. His teachings have influenced laws, art, literature, and entire civilizations. But there is a question that goes deeper than faith. What can history actually tell us about Jesus? Did Jesus really exist? Do sources outside the Bible mention him? Did a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate really execute him? And what about the resurrection? Can historians prove what happened? Or does history eventually reach a point where faith begins? In this documentary, we are going to separate the evidence from the assumptions. We will look at ancient sources. We will examine what historians actually agree on. And we will ask one important question: what really happened to Jesus? Before discussing miracles or resurrection, we need to establish something more basic. Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? Among professional historians of antiquity, the existence of Jesus is not generally considered a serious historical controversy. The evidence comes from multiple ancient sources. Some are Christian, some are Jewish, some are Roman, and they were written at different times and in different contexts. These sources do not all agree on theology. They do not all have the same purpose. But together, they provide evidence for a historical figure named Jesus. He was associated with Nazareth. He gathered followers. He became known as a teacher. He was executed during the rule of Pontius Pilate. And after his death, his followers continued proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. That last claim is where history becomes especially interesting. Because historians can investigate the claim, but historians also have to ask what kind of evidence history can actually provide. The first major challenge is simple. Jesus did not leave behind writings that we know were written by him. We have no surviving document personally written by Jesus. We also do not have a Roman biography of Jesus written during his lifetime. That means historians have to reconstruct his life from later sources. This is normal for ancient history. Most people from the ancient world left no writings of their own. Historians therefore depend on people who knew them, people who heard about them, people who wrote about them, and sometimes people who opposed them. For Jesus, the earliest sources are especially important. The letters of Paul are among the earliest surviving Christian writings. Several of Paul's letters are generally dated to the middle of the 1st century. That places them relatively close to the time of Jesus. Paul was not writing a modern biography. His letters were written to early Christian communities, but they contain important information about Jesus. Paul refers to Jesus as a historical person. He refers to his crucifixion. He refers to his followers, and he identifies people connected directly with the earliest movement. One of the most important passages appears in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Paul reminds his readers of the message he had previously delivered to them. He says that Christ died for sins. He says that he was buried. He says that he was raised. And he says that he appeared to various people. Paul then mentions Cephas, or Peter. He mentions the 12. He also mentions James. And Paul identifies James as the brother of the Lord. This matters historically. James is also associated with the early Christian community in Jerusalem. Paul's letters therefore give historians a window into the earliest decades of the Christian movement. They show that belief in Jesus' death and resurrection was not something invented centuries later. It was already central to Christianity very early. But there is an important distinction. Paul's letters are evidence that early Christians believed Jesus had risen. That does not automatically prove the resurrection happened. That is a separate historical question, and we will come back to it later. Then we come to the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These texts are the primary narratives about Jesus in the New Testament. They describe his ministry, his teachings, his miracles, his disciples, his conflict with religious authorities, his crucifixion, and his reported resurrection. The Gospels were written after Jesus' lifetime, but they are still ancient sources. Mark is generally considered the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. Matthew and Luke are generally dated later. John is usually dated later still. Scholars debate the exact dates. They also debate the relationship between the Gospels. But one thing is clear: the Jesus movement did not begin centuries after Jesus. It began in the 1st century. and the gospel traditions emerged within that early Christian movement. This is important because historical distance matters. A source written much closer to an event is generally more useful than a source written hundreds of years later. The Gospels therefore deserve historical examination, but they also need to be examined critically. They are not neutral modern biographies. They were written by people presenting theological claims about Jesus. That does not automatically make them historically useless. It means historians must examine what they say, how they were transmitted, and how they compare with other evidence. So, what can we establish so far? A Jewish teacher named Jesus existed in the 1st century. He was associated with Nazareth. He attracted followers. His movement developed in the Jewish world of Roman-controlled Judea. His followers believed he was the Messiah. They believed he had been crucified. And very early Christians proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. But so far, most of our evidence comes from Christian sources. So the next question becomes even more important. What did people outside the Christian movement say about Jesus? Did Roman writers mention him? Did Jewish historians mention him? And is there evidence that confirms some of the basic events described in the New Testament? There are several important sources, and 2 names stand out: Josephus and Tacitus. Their writings take us outside the Christian movement, and they give us an entirely different perspective on Jesus. The earliest Christian sources tell us what Jesus' followers believed. But what about people outside the Christian movement? Did Jewish and Roman writers mention Jesus? And can their writings confirm some of the basic events surrounding his life? 2 ancient historians are especially important: Josephus and Tacitus. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian. He lived during the 1st century. He was born around the time Jesus was beginning his ministry. Josephus later became an important historian of the Jewish people. His writings describe Jewish society under Roman rule. He also discusses several figures connected to the period of Jesus. One of the most famous passages is found in Antiquities of the Jews, written around the end of the 1st century. It is commonly called the Testimonium Flavianum. The passage mentions Jesus. It describes him as a teacher. It also refers to his execution under Pontius Pilate. And it mentions people who continued to follow him. But there is an important complication. Most scholars believe that the passage was edited by Christian copyists at some point. Certain phrases in the surviving version sound strongly Christian. Because of this, historians do not simply treat the entire passage as untouched words from Josephus. However, many scholars believe that Josephus probably did write an earlier version of the passage. The exact wording is debated, but the reference is still historically important. Josephus provides another important reference. This one is much less controversial. In another passage, Josephus describes the death of James. He identifies James as the brother of Jesus, and he describes Jesus as the one who is called Christ. This passage is significant. Why? Because Josephus was not writing a Christian gospel. He was a Jewish historian. He was describing events within the Jewish community, and his reference connects Jesus to James. This fits with what we already saw in Paul's letters. Paul also identifies James as the brother of the Lord. So we have 2 different ancient sources pointing toward the same basic historical connection. Jesus had a figure named James associated with him. James became an important leader in the early Christian movement, and Josephus knew of him. This does not prove every detail about Jesus, but it adds another piece to the historical picture. Now, we move from a Jewish historian to a Roman historian. His name was Tacitus. Tacitus was one of Rome's most important historians. He wrote about the Roman Empire. He also wrote about Emperor Nero, and this is where Jesus enters his historical account. Tacitus discusses the Great Fire of Rome during Nero's reign. After the fire, Nero blamed the Christians. Tacitus then explains the origin of the name Christian. He says the name came from Christ. Tacitus states that Christ was executed during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and he specifically connects the execution with Pontius Pilate. This is extremely important, because Tacitus was not writing to promote Christianity. In fact, he had a very negative view of Christians. He described Christianity as a harmful superstition, yet he still records the basic claim that Christ had been executed under Pontius Pilate. This provides an important independent Roman reference. Pontius Pilate is one of the most important historical figures in the story of Jesus. The New Testament describes him as the Roman authority who authorized Jesus' crucifixion. For a long time, critics questioned how much we could independently establish about Pilate. But archaeology eventually gave us an important piece of evidence. In the 1960s, archaeologists discovered an inscription at Caesarea Maritima. The inscription contains the name Pontius Pilate. It also identifies him with the title Prefect of Judea. This is significant. We are not simply depending on the New Testament for the existence of Pilate. We have archaeological evidence for the historical Roman official, and we have literary sources connecting him with Jesus' execution. The pieces fit together. Jesus lived under Roman rule, Pontius Pilate governed Judea, and Jesus was executed during Pilate's administration. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the strongest historical points about his life. It appears in all 4 canonical Gospels. It appears in early Christian writings. It is mentioned by Tacitus, and it fits the known Roman practice of execution. Crucifixion was a Roman method of punishment. It was particularly associated with slaves, rebels, and people considered dangerous to Roman authority. Jesus was executed by crucifixion, and the historical evidence for this event is strong. Even historians who do not accept Christian claims about the resurrection generally accept that Jesus was crucified. This is an important distinction. Historical scholarship does not require someone to believe Jesus was the Son of God in order to accept that he was crucified. The crucifixion is a historical claim. The meaning of the crucifixion is a theological claim. Those are related, but they are not identical. There are also other ancient references connected to Jesus and the early Christian movement. One example comes from Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a Roman official. In a letter to Emperor Trajan, he describes Christians in their worship. He says that they gathered and sang hymns to Christ. This letter does not give us a biography of Jesus. It was written decades after Jesus' death. But it demonstrates something important. By the early 2nd century, Christians were widespread enough to attract Roman attention, and they were worshiping Christ. Another Jewish source is the Babylonian Talmud. Some passages have traditionally been connected with Jesus. However, these references are complicated. Their dates are debated. Their wording is difficult, and historians are cautious about using them as straightforward evidence. So they should not be treated as strong evidence in the same way as Tacitus or Josephus. Now we come to archaeology. Can archaeology prove that Jesus existed? Not directly. Archaeologists have not discovered Jesus' personal house. They have not discovered an object that belonged to Jesus with his name written on it. And there is no archaeological artifact that proves every event described in the Gospels. But archaeology can provide something extremely valuable: context. It can show us what 1st century Judea looked like. It can reveal how people lived. It can confirm the existence of places. It can confirm political structures. It can confirm cultural practices. And sometimes it can illuminate details found in ancient texts. We already mentioned the inscription connected to Pontius Pilate. Other discoveries have helped historians understand 1st century Jewish burial practices. Archaeology has also provided evidence for settlements and locations mentioned in the New Testament. For example, excavations at Nazareth have provided evidence that the settlement existed during the period when Jesus would have lived there. This matters because archaeology does not need to discover Jesus personally to contribute to historical research. It can test whether the world described by the sources is historically plausible. And much of that background fits what we know about 1st century Galilee and Judea. So what can we reasonably say at this point? Jesus was a real 1st century Jewish figure. He was associated with Nazareth. He gathered followers. He was active in Galilee and Judea. He became known as a teacher. He was executed by crucifixion. The execution occurred under Pontius Pilate. His followers continued after his death, and very early Christians proclaimed that he had risen from the dead. These points have different levels of evidence. Some are stronger than others. Some come from multiple independent sources. Others depend more heavily on Christian testimony. And this is where historical analysis becomes especially important. Because history can investigate what people claimed. It can examine when they made those claims. It can compare different sources. It can examine whether alternative explanations fit the evidence. But history has limits. It cannot simply turn every supernatural claim into a laboratory experiment. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. What happened after Jesus was buried? Did his followers simply believe he had risen? Or did something happen that caused them to believe they had actually encountered the risen Jesus? And can history tell us anything about that? That is where the evidence becomes most controversial. We now have a historical picture of Jesus. He lived in first-century Judea. He gathered followers. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and his followers continued after his death. But then something happened. His followers began proclaiming that Jesus was alive. They claimed that he had risen from the dead. This is the central claim of Christianity. So what can history actually tell us about it? The four Gospels all describe Jesus being buried. They also describe his tomb being found empty. But historians debate how strongly the empty tomb can be established. Some historians accept the empty tomb as historically probable. Others are more cautious. One reason the question matters is the early Christian claim that Jesus had been raised physically from the dead. The Gospel accounts also name people connected with the burial. Joseph of Arimathea is presented as the person who provided the tomb. The women are described as discovering the empty tomb, and the disciples are then said to have encountered Jesus alive. But there is an important distinction. An empty tomb by itself does not prove resurrection. A body could theoretically be missing for other reasons. So historians have to examine the complete collection of evidence. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from Paul. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul gives an early summary of the Christian message. He says that Christ died. He says that Christ was buried. He says that Christ was raised. And he says that Christ appeared to witnesses. Paul then names several people. He mentions Peter. He mentions the 12. He mentions James. And he mentions himself. This is important because Paul was writing relatively early in the history of Christianity. The resurrection belief was therefore not something that appeared centuries later. It was already central to the movement at a very early stage. But again, there is an important distinction. Paul's letters demonstrate that these people believed Jesus had risen. They do not automatically prove that the resurrection happened. That question requires further analysis. Something clearly happened to the early followers of Jesus. Before his death, their movement appeared to be centered around a teacher who had been executed. After his death, they publicly proclaimed that God had raised him. They continued preaching despite opposition. They built communities around the belief that Jesus was alive, and they placed the resurrection at the center of their message. This raises an important historical question. Why did they believe this? Several explanations have been proposed. Some historians argue that the disciples experienced genuine visions or religious experiences. Others argue that the resurrection accounts developed through the growth of early Christian tradition. Christian historians argue that the simplest explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. There is no universal historical agreement on the explanation, and this is where history reaches one of its limits. History normally works by examining evidence. It compares sources. It examines testimony. It studies archaeological discoveries. It considers what explanations best fit the available evidence. But a miracle is different. A resurrection is not an ordinary historical event. It is a supernatural claim. Therefore, whether someone accepts the resurrection as a historical conclusion also depends on their understanding of what is possible. A historian who believes miracles are impossible will naturally reject a resurrection explanation. A historian who believes miracles are possible may consider resurrection as an explanation worth considering. This does not mean evidence is irrelevant. It means the philosophical assumptions behind historical interpretation matter. So we should be honest. History can establish that the resurrection was proclaimed very early. History can examine the testimony of the people who claim to have seen Jesus alive. History can examine the empty tomb tradition. But history cannot reproduce the resurrection in a laboratory. The event happened once, if it happened at all. Despite the debates, there are several facts about Jesus that have strong historical support. Jesus existed. He was Jewish. He lived in the 1st century. He was associated with Nazareth. He attracted followers. He taught publicly. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers continued after his death. and very early Christians believed that he had appeared to them after his death. These points create an important historical foundation, but they do not answer every theological question. History cannot determine the full meaning of Jesus' identity by historical evidence alone. It can investigate what people said about him. It can investigate what he did. It can investigate how his movement developed. But questions such as whether Jesus was truly the Son of God involve theology and faith as well as history. So where do the Gospels fit? The Gospels are ancient sources. They are also theological documents. They were written to tell people who Jesus was. That means we should neither blindly accept every detail without examination, nor automatically dismiss them because they are religious texts. Instead, they should be studied like other ancient sources. Historians examine their language. They examine their historical setting. They compare them with one another. They compare them with archaeological evidence, and they compare them with other ancient writings. The Gospels contain differences in wording and emphasis, but they also share a common central story. Jesus lived, he taught, he gathered disciples, he was crucified, he was buried, and his followers proclaimed that he rose again. The details are debated, the central historical impact is undeniable. So what actually happened? History gives us a surprisingly strong starting point. Jesus was not simply a fictional character invented centuries later. He was a real first-century Jewish man. His movement began during his lifetime. He was executed by Roman authority, and his followers continued to proclaim him after his death. Within a very early period, they were already claiming that he had risen. That claim transformed their movement. It spread throughout the Roman world, and eventually Christianity became one of the most influential movements in human history. But the final question remains: did Jesus actually rise from the dead? History can investigate the evidence. It can establish the early belief. It can examine the testimony. It can examine the empty tomb tradition. But whether the resurrection is ultimately accepted as a real miracle goes beyond what historical method can demonstrate with absolute certainty. That is where evidence meets interpretation. And for Christians, that is where history meets faith. The historical record does not answer every question about Jesus, but it does tell us something powerful. Jesus lived, Jesus taught, Jesus gathered followers, Jesus was crucified, and his followers believed something extraordinary had happened after his death. They believed that God had raised him. They built their entire movement around that conviction, and that movement changed the world. For Christians, Jesus is more than a historical figure. He is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the risen Christ. History can investigate the evidence surrounding those claims, but ultimately every person has to decide what they believe about Jesus. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Jesus is not simply that historians still discuss him. It is that his story has survived for nearly 2,000 years. His teachings are still read, his name is still spoken, and millions of people around the world still believe he is alive. So, the question is no longer simply, did Jesus exist? The historical evidence gives us a strong reason to answer yes. The deeper question is, who was Jesus? A teacher? A prophet? The Messiah? Or exactly who he claimed to be? That question is still open to every person who encounters his story. If you found this documentary informative, like this video and share it with someone interested in Jesus and history. Subscribe to With Jesus for more documentaries exploring Jesus, the Bible, history, and the evidence behind the Christian story. Keep seeking, keep questioning, keep discovering, and most importantly, keep walking with Jesus. God bless you.